The dust from the wagon train had barely settled when Delilah Rogers realized she had nowhere to sleep but a borrowed canvas tent already crowded with 3 other families. And the Colorado sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains near Aspen in the late summer of 1882. She stood at the edge of what the locals were calling the Tent City, a sprawling collection of makeshift shelters that had sprung up on the outskirts of town after the silver boom had drawn more hopeful souls than the boarding houses could accommodate. Her trunk sat at her feet, containing everything she owned in the world, which was not much after paying for passage west and losing her father to pneumonia somewhere in Kansas. The wind carried the scent of campfire smoke and hope mixed with desperation, and she wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as the temperature began to drop. Delilah had turned 19 just 2 weeks before her father died, and now she found herself alone in a frontier town with $43 to her name and a teaching certificate that the school board had politely informed her they could not honor because the position had been filled by the previous teacher's nephew. She had watched other women arrive in Aspen with nothing and manage to build lives, but standing there among the tents, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest like a stone. "You will need to find your own space by nightfall," a tired-looking woman with 2 children clinging to her skirts told her. "That tent yonder has some room, but the family that runs it expects help with cooking and washing in exchange for a corner to sleep in." Delilah nodded and picked up her trunk, struggling with its weight as she made her way through the narrow paths between shelters. The tent city was larger than she had imagined, stretching across a field that had probably once been grazing land. Women were cooking over small fires. Men were returning from the mines or the town looking for work, and children were running between the tents with the kind of energy that seemed unaffected by poverty or uncertainty. She found the tent the woman had mentioned and met the Hendersons, a family of 5 who had come from Ohio with dreams of striking silver. Mrs. Henderson was a stout woman with kind eyes and worn hands who looked Delilah over with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to judge character quickly. "You can stay if you earn your keep," Mrs. Henderson said without preamble. "I need help with the washing and mending, and if you can cook, that would be useful too. We share what food we have, but everyone contributes what they can." "I can do all of those things," Delilah said, setting down her trunk with relief. "I am grateful for the shelter." That first night, she lay on a thin bedroll in the corner of the tent, listening to the sounds of the Henderson children sleeping and the wind rattling the canvas above her. She thought about her father's dreams of a better life out west, and she wondered if he would be disappointed to see her like this, living in a tent with strangers, her future more uncertain than ever. But she had inherited his determination along with his blue eyes, and she promised herself that this would not be her permanent situation. The next morning, Delilah woke before dawn and helped Mrs. Henderson prepare breakfast, a simple meal of porridge and coffee that stretched to feed 7 people. Then she took a basket of laundry down to the creek that ran behind the tent city, joining a line of other women who were scrubbing clothes against rocks and wringing them out in the cold water. Her hands quickly became raw, but she kept working, listening to the conversations around her. "My husband heard there might be work at the Morrison Ranch," one woman was saying. "They are looking for men to help with the cattle drive next month." "The Morrison Ranch," another woman scoffed. "That place is run by Nathan Irving now since old Morrison died last spring. They say he is a hard man to work for, expects everything done his way. Hard but fair, I heard. And he pays on time, which is more than you can say for some of the mine owners." Delilah filed the information away, thinking that perhaps she could find work at her ranch. though she knew that most ranchers had little use for single women unless they were looking for a wife, and she was not ready to consider that option out of desperation. She spent the rest of that day and the days that followed falling into a routine. She washed clothes, mended tears in fabric, helped prepare meals, and tried to make herself useful enough that the Hendersons would let her stay. In the evenings, she would walk through Aspen, looking for work opportunities, asking at the general store, the restaurant, the hotel. But everyone told her the same thing. There were no positions available, or they had already hired someone, or they would keep her name in mind if something opened up. 2 weeks passed, and Delilah felt herself becoming just another face in the tent city, one of dozens of people struggling to gain a foothold in this town that had promised so much but delivered so little. Her money was running out faster than she had anticipated, going toward contributions for food and small necessities. She began to worry that she would have to consider options she had been avoiding, perhaps accepting work in one of the saloons, though the thought made her stomach turn. It was on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after her arrival, that she first saw Nathan Irving. She was carrying water from the creek back to the tent, balancing 2 heavy buckets on a wooden yoke across her shoulders, when a rider on a large bay horse came down the path. She stepped aside to let him pass, but instead of riding by, he stopped. "That looks heavy for someone your size," he said, and she looked up to see a man in his mid-20s with sun-weathered skin, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in the saddle, and his clothes, while dusty, were well made and practical. "I am managing just fine, thank you," Delilah said, because her father had taught her to be independent, and she was not in the habit of accepting help from strange men, even if her shoulders were aching. Nathan Irving tilted his hat back slightly and studied her for a moment. "I am sure you are. But that does not mean you should have to manage alone when there is help available." Before she could protest, he had dismounted and was reaching for the yoke. Delilah stepped back instinctively, water sloshing over the edges of the buckets. "I said I am managing," she repeated, more firmly this time. "And I heard you," he replied, his tone mild but persistent. "But I was raised to help when I see someone struggling and those buckets are heavy." "Where are you taking them?" Delilah hesitated, torn between pride and practicality. Her shoulders really were aching, and she still had a full day of work ahead of her. "The Henderson tent, near the edge of the camp." He nodded and waited, and finally she allowed him to take the yoke from her. He lifted it onto his own shoulders with an ease that made her aware of just how difficult it had been for her, and began walking in the direction she indicated. She followed, acutely aware of the curious looks from other women in the tent city who were watching this interaction with interest. "You are new here," Nathan said as they walked. It was not a question. "I arrived 3 weeks ago, and you are staying with the Hendersons, for now, until I can find work and afford my own place." He was quiet for a moment, navigating around a tent rope. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Any honest work," Delilah said. "I have a teaching certificate, but the school position was already filled. I can cook, clean, mend, keep accounts. I am willing to learn other skills if someone is willing to teach me." They reached the Henderson tent, and Nathan carefully set down the buckets near the entrance. He straightened and looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. "I am Nathan Irving. I run the Morrison Ranch about 5 miles north of town." "Delilah Rogers," she said, offering her hand because her father had taught her that a firm handshake was worth more than a simpering curtsy. Nathan shook her hand with a grip that was strong but not crushing, and she noticed his hands were calloused from hard work. "Miss Rogers, I am not in the habit of making hasty decisions, but I find myself short a housekeeper since the last one left to get married. The work is hard, the hours are long, but I pay fair wages and provide room and board. If you are interested, you can come out to the ranch tomorrow and I will show you what the position entails." Delilah felt her heart skip. A real job with wages and a roof over her head. It seemed too good to be true, which made her cautious. "Why would you offer this to someone you just met?" "Because I need a housekeeper and you need work. And because Mrs. Henderson is a friend of my late mother's, and she has mentioned you are a hard worker who could use a break." He must have seen the surprise on her face because he added, "I was coming to visit her when I saw you with the buckets. She wrote to me last week, suggesting I might consider hiring you." That made more sense. Mrs. Henderson had not mentioned anything to her, probably not wanting to raise false hopes, but it touched Delilah that the woman had been thinking of ways to help her. "I would be very interested in discussing the position," Delilah said carefully. "What time should I come to the ranch tomorrow? I will send a wagon for you at 8 in the morning. Pack your things. If we come to an agreement, you can start right away and stay in the housekeeper's quarters." After he left, riding his bay horse back toward the main road, Delilah stood for a moment in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the tent, having clearly overheard the conversation. "That Nathan Irving is a good man," she said quietly. "His mother, rest her soul, was the finest woman I ever knew, and she raised her son right. You will be safe working for him, and the work will be hard but honest. You wrote to him about me." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "I could see you were struggling, and I knew Nathan needed help at the ranch. It seemed like a solution that could benefit both of you. But do not feel obligated. If you prefer to stay here, you are welcome to do so." Delilah shook her head. "No, I am grateful, truly. This is exactly the kind of opportunity I have been praying for." That night, she carefully packed her trunk again, folding her few dresses and personal items with hands that trembled slightly from nervous excitement. She barely slept, imagining what the ranch would be like, what her duties would entail, whether she would be able to meet Nathan Irving's expectations. She had no experience working on a ranch, but she was a quick learner and determined to prove herself worthy of this chance. The wagon arrived promptly at 8, driven by an older man who introduced himself as Tom, one of the ranch hands. He helped her load her trunk, and then they set off, following the road north out of Aspen. The morning was clear and beautiful, the mountains rising majestically to the east, the valleys spread out in shades of gold and green. As they drove, Tom told her about the ranch, how Nathan had taken it over when his Uncle Morrison had died without children, how Nathan had worked hard to make it profitable and fair for the men who worked for him. "He is a good boss," Tom said, guiding the horses around a rocky section of road. "Tough when he needs to be, but he never asks us to do anything he would not do himself. And he treats everyone with respect, which is more than I can say for some of the other ranchers around here." The ranch came into view as they crested a hill, and Delilah caught her breath at the sight. It was larger than she had expected, with a main house built of logs and stone, several outbuildings including a large barn, corrals with horses and cattle, and stretching beyond it all, miles of grazing land backed by mountains. It looked prosperous and well-maintained, and she felt a surge of hope that this place might become her home. Nathan was waiting on the porch of the main house when the wagon pulled up. He helped her down and gestured for Tom to take her trunk inside. "Welcome to the Morrison Ranch," he said. "Let me show you around and explain what the position involves." He led her through the main house, which was spacious but clearly lacked a woman's touch. The furniture was practical but sparse, the floors were dusty, and the kitchen, while well-equipped, showed signs of a man who cooked only out of necessity rather than skill. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, one of which Nathan used, and a smaller room off the kitchen that would be hers if she accepted the position. The housekeeper is responsible for keeping the house clean, doing the laundry, cooking meals for myself and any hands who eat at the house, and managing the household supplies, Nathan explained as they walked. During busy seasons like roundup or cattle drives, you might be cooking for a dozen men at a time. You would have Sundays off, and I pay $30 a month plus room and board. $30 a month was more than Delilah had dared hope for. She tried not to let her eagerness show too plainly. That sounds more than fair. I accept the position. Nathan smiled, and it transformed his face from stern to almost handsome. You might want to see the rest of the ranch before you decide. It is not an easy life out here, and you would be fairly isolated. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, and town is a long wagon ride. I am not afraid of hard work or isolation, Delilah said firmly, and I would much rather be here than living in a tent. Then let me show you the rest of the place. They spent the next hour walking around the ranch. Nathan introduced her to the other hands, 5 men in total who ranged in age from Tom, who was in his 60s, to a young man named Billy, who could not have been more than 20. He showed her the barn with its neat rows of stalls, the hen house where she would collect eggs each morning, the smokehouse and root cellar where food was stored. Everything was organized and efficient, and she could see that Nathan ran the ranch with careful attention to detail. As they walked, he told her about the ranch's operations. They raised cattle primarily, with some horses, and grew hay and vegetables for their own use. The work was seasonal, with intense periods during calving, branding, and the cattle drive to market, and quieter times during winter when the focus was on maintenance and caring for the animals through the cold months. I inherited this place from my uncle 2 years ago, Nathan said as they stood looking out over the grazing cattle. He was a good rancher but a hard man. I have been trying to run things differently, treating the men fairly, building something that will last. It has not been easy, but we are starting to turn a real profit. Why did he leave it to you rather than his children? Delilah asked, then immediately wondered if she had been too forward with the question, but Nathan did not seem offended. He never married, never had children. My mother was his sister, and he saw potential in me when I was young. He taught me everything about ranching, and when he knew he was dying, he made me his heir. Some people in town thought I was too young to handle it, but I have proven them wrong. There was quiet pride in his voice, and Delilah found herself respecting his determination. She knew what it was like to have people doubt you because of your age or circumstances. They returned to the house as the sun reached its peak. I will leave you to get settled, Nathan said. Supper is usually at 6, and I would appreciate if you could manage something more appetizing than what I have been cooking for myself. Tom can show you where everything is in the pantry and root cellar. After he left, Delilah explored her new quarters. The room off the kitchen was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a chair, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was more space than she had had to herself in months, and it was warm and dry and safe. She unpacked her trunk, hanging her dresses on pegs on the wall and placing her few books on top of the dresser. Then she went to investigate the kitchen, taking inventory of supplies and planning her first meal. By 6 o'clock, she had prepared a supper of fried chicken, biscuits, green beans from the garden, and apple pie made from preserved apples she had found in the root cellar. She set the table in the dining room and called Nathan when everything was ready. He came in from outside, having washed up at the pump, and stopped in the doorway when he saw the table. This looks wonderful. I cannot remember the last time someone made me a real meal. They sat down to eat, and Delilah felt nervous under his gaze as he took his first bite. But his expression of satisfaction told her everything she needed to know. "Miss Rogers, if you can cook like this every day, you will have earned your wages twice over," he said. "This is delicious. Thank you, and please call me Delilah." "Miss Rogers sounds too formal if we are going to be living under the same roof." "Delilah, then, and you should call me Nathan. We do not stand much on ceremony out here." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Nathan spoke again. "Tell me about yourself. How did you end up in Aspen living in a tent city?" Delilah told him about her father's dream of coming west, about their journey and his death, about her failed attempt to secure the teaching position. She found herself speaking more freely than she had expected, perhaps because Nathan listened without interruption or judgment, his gray eyes focused on her face with genuine interest. "I am sorry about your father," he said when she finished. "Losing a parent is hard. I lost my mother 3 years ago, and there are still days when I want to ask her advice about something and have to remember she is gone." "What about your father?" Delilah asked. Nathan's expression darkened slightly. "He died when I was 12. He was a prospector, always chasing the next big strike. One day he went into a mine that was not properly shored up, and it collapsed. My mother never really recovered from it. She moved us here to be near her brother, and Uncle Morrison gave us a place to live and me a job. In a way, this ranch saved us." They talked through supper and into the evening, and Delilah found herself surprised by how easy it was to converse with Nathan. He was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged when he told stories about ranch life. By the time they said goodnight, and Delilah retreated to her room, she felt more hopeful about her situation than she had in months. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Delilah woke before dawn and prepared breakfast for Nathan and any hands who came to the house, then spent her days cleaning, doing laundry, tending the vegetable garden, collecting eggs, and preparing meals. The work was indeed hard, and there was always something that needed doing, but she found satisfaction in it. The house began to look more cared for under her attention, and she took pride in the meals she prepared and the cleanliness she maintained. Nathan was a considerate employer. He never made unreasonable demands, always thanked her for her work, and treated her with respect. Sometimes in the evenings, if his work was done early, he would sit in the kitchen while she prepared supper and they would talk. She learned that he loved the ranch, but sometimes felt the weight of responsibility heavily, that he hoped to expand the cattle operation over the next few years, that he had once thought about marrying, but the woman he had courted had decided ranch life was too hard and married a banker instead. "That was 2 years ago," he said one evening in early October as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I thought I loved her, but looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of having someone to share this life with. She was right to choose someone else. She would have been miserable here. Not everyone is suited for this life," Delilah agreed, "but some of us find that it suits us better than we expected." He looked at her with interest. "Are you saying you like it here?" "I am saying I do not miss the tent city at all," she replied with a smile. "And I am grateful every day for a warm bed and steady work. You have earned it. The house has not been this well kept since my mother was alive, and the men keep telling me that your cooking is the best they have had in years." Delilah felt herself blush at the compliment. She had become aware over the past weeks that her feelings toward Nathan were shifting from simple gratitude to something more complicated. He was handsome in a rugged way, and she admired his work ethic and the fairness with which he treated everyone on the ranch. But more than that, she enjoyed his company, looked forward to their evening conversations, and found herself disappointed on nights when he was too busy to join her. October brought cold winds down from the mountains and the first light snows. The ranch prepared for winter, stockpiling hay, checking the soundness of buildings, making sure everything was ready for the harsh months ahead. Nathan worked from dawn until well after dark many days, and Delilah could see the strain it put on him. She made sure he ate proper meals and occasionally convinced him to rest when she could see he was pushing himself too hard. One evening in late October, a storm blew in with unexpected fury. The wind howled around the house, rattling windows and driving snow sideways. Nathan had been out checking on the cattle and did not return when Delilah expected him. She kept supper warm and tried not to worry, but as the hours passed and the storm intensified, fear began to gnaw at her. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she finally heard the sound of the door opening. Nathan stumbled in, covered in snow and shivering violently. Delilah rushed to help him, guiding him to a chair near the stove. "You are frozen through," she said, her hands already working to remove his wet coat. "What were you thinking, staying out so long?" "Had to make sure the cattle were sheltered," he said through chattering teeth. "Did not realize the storm would get this bad." She fetched blankets and wrapped them around him, then poured hot coffee and made him drink it. His face was dangerously pale, and she could see that his hands were red and numb from the cold. Without thinking about propriety, she pulled off his wet boots and socks and began rubbing his feet to restore circulation. "Delilah, you do not have to," he started to protest. "Hush," she said firmly. "You could lose toes to frostbite if we do not get the blood flowing again. Let me help you." She worked on his feet and then his hands, rubbing them gently but firmly until the color began to return and he stopped shivering quite so violently. Then she heated up his supper and made him eat, standing over him like a stern nurse until he had finished everything on his plate. "You are a stubborn woman," Nathan said, but there was warmth in his voice and his eyes. "And you are a stubborn man for staying out in a storm like that. The cattle would have been fine without you for one night. Maybe. But it is my responsibility to make sure they are safe. And who is responsible for making sure you are safe?" The words came out more emotionally than she had intended, revealing the depth of her concern. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "I suppose you are, since you are the one who insisted on warming me up and feeding me." "Someone has to look after you," Delilah said, trying to make her tone lighter. "You certainly do not do a good job of it yourself." That night, after Nathan had gone upstairs to bed and she had retreated to her own room, Delilah lay awake thinking about the fear she had felt when he had not returned, about the way her heart had lifted when he had finally come through the door. She was falling in love with him, she realized. It had happened gradually, over weeks of working together and talking together and building something that felt like a partnership, rather than just an employer and employee relationship. But she had no idea if he felt anything similar, and she was afraid to risk the security of her position by revealing her feelings. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them all at the ranch. Nathan was forced to rest more than usual, and he spent much of the time in the kitchen, ostensibly to stay near the warmth of the stove, but really, Delilah suspected, to be near her. They talked about everything and nothing, played cards in the evenings, and discovered they had similar views on many subjects. The intimacy of being snowbound together deepened their connection, and by the time the storm broke and the sun came out, something fundamental had shifted between them. November brought more snow and the quiet season on the ranch. The cattle were moved to lower pastures where they could be fed and monitored more easily, and the daily work became focused on maintenance and animal care rather than the intense activity of summer and fall. Nathan began a project that surprised Delilah. About a half-mile from the main house, on a pretty spot overlooking a creek, he started building a cabin. "What is that for?" she asked one day when she brought him lunch where he was working. "Just a project to keep busy during the slow season," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I thought it might be useful to have another dwelling on the property." But as the cabin took shape over the following weeks, Delilah began to suspect it was more than just a project. Nathan worked on it with careful attention, building it solidly with good materials, adding touches that seemed designed for comfort rather than pure utility. He installed glass windows, something not strictly necessary for a simple work cabin. He built a large fireplace with river stone. He made sure the roof was well insulated and the floor was level and smooth. Sometimes she would walk out to watch him work, bringing him water or coffee, and they would stand together looking at his progress. He never explicitly said who the cabin was for, but something in the way he looked at her when they stood there made her heart beat faster. December brought preparations for Christmas, and Delilah threw herself into making the ranch house festive. She baked cookies and cakes, strung dried berries and popcorn for decorations, and convinced Nathan to cut down a small pine tree that she decorated with ribbons and paper ornaments she made herself. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine, and even the ranch hands commented that it felt more like a home than it had in years. On Christmas Eve, after a large supper that included all the hands, Nathan asked Delilah to take a walk with him despite the cold. They bundled up in coats and scarves and walked through the snow toward the cabin he had been building. It was finished now, she realized as they approached. Smoke was rising from the chimney, suggesting he had started a fire earlier. "I want to show you something," Nathan said, his breath visible in the cold air. He opened the door and gestured for her to go inside. The cabin was beautiful, warm from the fire burning in the fireplace, furnished with a bed, a table and chairs, a dresser, and even curtains on the windows. It was small but perfectly formed, exactly the kind of place a person could make into a cozy home. "Nathan, this is lovely," Delilah said, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Whoever you built this for is very lucky." "I built it for you," he said quietly. She turned to face him, her heart suddenly pounding. "What?" "I built this cabin for you, Delilah, because living in the main house you are always working. You are always the housekeeper, always on duty, never able to truly have space that is your own. I thought you deserved a place where you could have privacy, where you could rest without feeling like you need to be doing something for the ranch." Delilah felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I do not know what to say. This is incredibly kind, but I cannot accept something like this. It is too much." "It is not too much. You have brought life back to this ranch, Delilah. Before you came, I was just going through the motions, working myself to exhaustion without really living. You have made this place feel like a home again. You have made me remember what it is like to look forward to the end of the day, to enjoy a good meal and good conversation. You have made me happy, and I wanted to do something to make you happy in return." "Nathan," she whispered, taking a step toward him, "you do make me happy. Every day. Not because of what you give me or what you build for me, but because of who you are." He closed the distance between them, reaching up to cup her face in his work-roughened hands. "Delilah Rogers, I am not good with fancy words, but I need you to know that I have fallen completely in love with you. I know I am just a rancher, and I cannot offer you an easy life or a fancy house in town, but I can offer you my heart and my promise that I will spend every day trying to make you smile. If you could see your way to caring for me even half as much as I care for you, I would count myself the luckiest man in Colorado." "Oh, Nathan," she said, reaching up to cover his hands with her own. "I do not want an easy life or a fancy house in town. I want this, the ranch and the mountains and the life we have been building together. And I want you. I have been in love with you for weeks, maybe longer, but I was afraid to say anything because I did not want to lose what we had." He kissed her then, a gentle kiss that tasted of hope and joy and the promise of a future together. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, letting all her carefully guarded feelings pour into that moment. When they finally broke apart, they were both smiling. "Does this mean you will accept the cabin?" Nathan asked, his gray eyes dancing with happiness. "Only if you promise to visit me there often," she replied. "I can do better than that. Delilah, will you marry me? I know we have not been courting in the traditional sense, but we have been living and working together for months now, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Say you will be my wife." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Nathan Irving. Nothing would make me happier." They stood in the cabin holding each other, the fire crackling in the hearth, snow falling softly outside the windows, and both of them feeling like they had finally found the place they were meant to be. After a while, they walked back to the main house hand in hand, and Nathan built up the fire in the parlor while Delilah made hot chocolate. They sat together on the sofa, her head resting on his shoulder, making plans for their future. "We can get married in the spring," Nathan said, playing with her fingers. "Unless you want a longer engagement, spring sounds perfect. I do not need a long engagement or a fancy wedding, I just need you." "We should probably tell people," he said with a smile. "Tom is going to say he knew all along. He has been dropping hints for weeks that I should just marry you already." Delilah laughed. "Mrs. Henderson will be pleased. She has been asking every time I see her in town if you are treating me well and if there are any romantic developments." On Christmas morning, they announced their engagement to the ranch hands over a festive breakfast. There were congratulations and back-slapping and general happiness all around. Tom did indeed claim he had known it was coming, and Billy shyly presented them with a horseshoe he had forged into the shape of a heart, saying it was for good luck. The winter months passed in a blur of happiness. Delilah moved into her cabin, and it became her sanctuary, a place where she could sew her wedding dress in the evenings and dream about the future. But she spent most of her days at the main house still, cooking and managing the household, because it brought her joy and because she loved being near Nathan. He had hired one of the Henderson daughters, a capable girl of 17, to help with heavy cleaning and laundry so that Delilah would not be overwhelmed with work. Nathan courted her properly during those months, taking her on sleigh rides through the snow-covered valleys, bringing her small gifts like a comb for her hair or a book he had ordered from Denver, sitting with her in the evenings by the fire and talking about their hopes and dreams. They discussed how they would run the ranch together, how they wanted to eventually build a real home to replace the main house, how many children they hoped to have. "I want at least 3, Nathan said one evening in February as they sat in her cabin. "Maybe 4. I grew up as an only child and always wished for siblings." "I think 4 sounds wonderful," Delilah agreed, "though you might change your mind after the first one when you see how much work babies are. Then I will just have to help you with them. My mother always said my father was useless with me as a baby, but I plan to be more involved than that." March brought the first signs of spring and preparations for the wedding. Delilah wanted a simple ceremony, and Nathan agreed. They planned to marry at the small church in Aspen, with just close friends and the ranch hands attending, followed by a celebration at the ranch. Mrs. Henderson insisted on helping with the wedding preparations, and several of the women from the tent city who had since found their footing in Aspen offered to bring food and help decorate. Delilah finished her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in ivory cotton with delicate embroidery on the bodice that she had worked on during quiet winter evenings. She had never been the type to dream of elaborate weddings, and she was perfectly content with the intimate celebration they had planned. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late April, when the valley was beginning to green and wildflowers were starting to bloom in the meadows. Delilah walked down the aisle of the small church on Tom's arm, since she had no father to give her away, and felt her heart swell when she saw Nathan waiting at the altar in a new suit, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with happy tears. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing. Someone had brought a fiddle, and the ranch hands took turns dancing with Delilah while Nathan watched with a smile. When the sun began to set, Nathan and Delilah finally escaped to her cabin, which would now be their cabin until they could build the larger house they had planned. Their wedding night was tender and loving, both of them nervous but eager, learning each other with gentle touches and whispered words. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking quietly about how perfect the day had been and how happy they were. "I love you, Mrs. Irving," Nathan said, kissing her temple. "I love you too, Mr. Irving, so very much." The next months were the happiest of Delilah's life. She and Nathan fell into an easy partnership, working together to run the ranch and build their life. They spent their days busy with all the tasks that came with the spring and summer seasons on a ranch: calving and branding, planting and tending the garden, managing the household and the hired hands. But they also made time for each other, taking evening walks, sitting together on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset, talking about everything and nothing. In June, Delilah began to suspect she might be pregnant. By July, she was certain, and she told Nathan one evening when they were alone in their cabin. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her up in his arms, careful not to squeeze too hard, and spun her around with a whoop of joy that was completely unlike his usual reserved manner. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "Delilah, you have made me the happiest man alive." "We are having a baby," she corrected with a laugh. "This is something we are doing together." Nathan became even more attentive during her pregnancy, constantly worrying that she was working too hard or not resting enough. He hired another woman to take over most of the household work, insisting that Delilah should focus on staying healthy and preparing for the baby. She protested that she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities, but she also appreciated his concern and allowed herself to rest more than she normally would have. As her belly grew through the late summer and fall, they made preparations for the baby. Nathan built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth and carving their initials into the headboard. Delilah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, accepting donations of baby items from women in town who had been through this before. They converted a corner of the cabin into a nursery area, and Delilah found herself spending hours imagining what their child would be like. "Do you hope for a boy or a girl?" she asked Nathan one October evening as they sat by the fire. "I just hope for a healthy baby and a safe delivery for you," he said seriously. "That is all that matters to me. But if you could choose," he thought for a moment, "a boy, I suppose, to eventually help run the ranch. But honestly, Delilah, I will be just as happy with a daughter. As long as the baby is healthy and you come through the birth safely, I could not ask for more." The baby came in late February, during a cold snap that had everyone huddled near fires and hoping for spring. Delilah's labor started in the early morning, and Nathan immediately sent Tom to fetch the midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Schmidt, who had delivered half the babies in Aspen. Then he stayed by Delilah's side, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping her forehead with cool cloths and trying not to let his worry show. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. Mrs. Schmidt remained calm throughout, but Delilah could see the strain on Nathan's face as he watched her suffer. She squeezed his hand and tried to be strong, but the pain was overwhelming at times, and she found herself crying out despite her determination to stay quiet. Finally, as midnight approached, their son was born. He came into the world squalling loudly, his face red and his tiny fists waving in indignation. Mrs. Schmidt cleaned him up and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Delilah's arms. Nathan leaned over them both, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son for the first time. "He is perfect," Nathan whispered. "Delilah, you did so well. He is absolutely perfect." The baby was indeed perfect, with a cap of dark hair like his father's and tiny features that made Delilah's heart ache with love. They named him Daniel Nathan Irving, and he quickly became the center of their world. Those first weeks were exhausting but wonderful. Delilah learned to feed and change and soothe her son, while Nathan proved true to his word about being an involved father. He would walk the floor with Daniel in the middle of the night when the baby was fussy, change diapers without complaint, and sit for hours just watching his son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Nathan said one night when he thought Delilah was asleep. He was holding Daniel against his shoulder, gently patting the baby's back. "You and your mother have given me everything I never knew I needed." Spring came again, bringing renewal to the ranch and new energy to Delilah as she recovered from childbirth. Daniel was a good baby, sleeping well and eating eagerly, growing stronger each day. Delilah would bring him outside in good weather, letting him feel the sun on his face and hear the sounds of the ranch, the cattle lowing, the horses whinnying, the chickens clucking in their coop. In May, Nathan started construction on the new house they had been planning. It would be larger than the cabin, with multiple bedrooms for the children they hoped to have, a proper kitchen with a big stove, a parlor for entertaining, and a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings. He worked on it whenever he had free time, and several of the ranch hands helped during slack periods. It rose slowly but steadily through the summer, taking shape board by board. On a warm day in August, almost exactly 2 years after Delilah had first arrived at the ranch, Nathan took her to see the progress on the house. It was not finished yet, but the structure was complete, the roof was on, and she could see what it would become. They stood in what would be the parlor, Daniel balanced on Delilah's hip, and Nathan wrapped his arm around both of them. "This is for us," he said. "For our family, for all the children we will have, for the life we are building together. You came here with nothing, Delilah, living in a tent and uncertain about your future. And now look at what we have created together." Delilah leaned into him, her eyes sweeping over the unfinished house and imagining it completed. "I never could have imagined this when I was living in that tent city. I was so lost then, so afraid of what would happen to me. And then you came along with your offer of a job and your kindness, and you changed everything." "We changed everything together," Nathan corrected. "I was just going through the motions before you arrived, Delilah. You brought life and joy back to this ranch and to me. You made me remember why I wanted this life in the first place." They moved into the new house in November, just before the first major snowfall. It was not completely finished on the inside. There was still trim work to be done and some rooms that needed proper furnishing, but it was livable and warm and spacious. Delilah loved having a real kitchen to work in and bedrooms for their growing family. They kept the cabin, using it sometimes as a guest house or a place for hired help to stay, but the new house became their true home. The years that followed were busy and fulfilling. Daniel grew from a baby into a toddler, learning to walk and talk, following his father around the ranch, and getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a small child. When he was 2, Delilah became pregnant again, and in the spring she gave birth to their second son, whom they named William after Nathan's father. 2 years after that came their daughter, Emma, a tiny girl with her mother's blue eyes and her father's determination. And 3 years after Emma came another son, Michael, completing their family of 6. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Nathan's careful planning and hard work paid off, and they were able to expand their cattle operation, hire more hands, and improve the property. Delilah managed the household and kept the books, discovering she had a talent for numbers and organization. Together, they made decisions about the ranch, and Nathan always consulted her on major purchases or changes, valuing her opinion and insights. They became a fixture in the Aspen community, known for their fairness and generosity. When hard times hit other ranchers or families in town, Nathan and Delilah were always among the first to offer help, whether it was lending money, providing food, or offering work to men who needed it. They never forgot what it was like to struggle, and they tried to ease the burdens of others when they could. Mrs. Henderson remained a close friend until her death, 10 years after Delilah had arrived in Colorado. At the funeral, Delilah wept not just for the loss of a dear friend, but for gratitude that this woman had taken a chance on a scared young woman living in a tent and had connected her with Nathan. She wondered how different her life would have been if Mrs. Henderson had not written that letter, and the thought made her clutch Nathan's hand tightly. The tent city eventually disappeared as Aspen grew and developed. The silver boom had its ups and downs, but the town endured, becoming a permanent settlement with real buildings and infrastructure. Delilah sometimes drove past where the tent city had been and marveled at how much had changed, both in the town and in her own life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nathan surprised her by taking her back to the cabin where he had proposed. He had arranged for the children to stay with friends for the night, and he had stocked the cabin with food and firewood and flowers. They spent the evening reminiscing about their courtship and early days of marriage, laughing over memories and holding each other close. "I built you a cabin and stayed to make sure you smiled," Nathan said as they lay together in the narrow bed they had shared as newlyweds. "That was my goal in the beginning, just to give you a safe place and bring some happiness into your life. But you gave me so much more in return. You gave me love and family and purpose. You made my life complete, Delilah." "You did the same for me," she replied, tracing the lines of his face with her fingers. They were both older now, marked by years of hard work and the responsibilities of raising a family, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "When I was living in that tent, I could not see how my life would ever get better. I felt so alone and frightened. And then you came along and offered me not just a job but a chance at a real life. You saw value in me when I was not sure I had any value left. You always had value, Delilah. I just helped you see it." They made love slowly and tenderly, reaffirming the bond between them. And afterward they talked late into the night about their children, their hopes for the future, and how grateful they were for the life they had built together. Their children grew up strong and capable, each one finding their own path while remaining connected to the ranch and the family. Daniel showed an early aptitude for ranching and declared by age 12 that he wanted to run the Morrison Ranch someday. William was quieter and more scholarly, interested in books and learning, and Nathan and Delilah saved money to send him to school in Denver when he was old enough. Emma was spirited and independent, equally comfortable riding horses and helping in the kitchen, determined to prove she could do anything her brothers could do. And Michael, the baby of the family, was the peacemaker, the one who could always make everyone laugh and who had inherited his father's calm demeanor. As the children reached their teenage years, Nathan and Delilah found themselves with more time to spend together again. They took up the habit of evening walks, just the two of them, discussing the events of the day and enjoying each other's company. The physical demands of ranch work had slowed Nathan slightly as he entered his 40s, though he remained strong and capable. Delilah had aged gracefully, with lines around her eyes that came from years of smiling and hair that had begun to show threads of silver. One evening in late summer, 20 years after Delilah had first come to the ranch, they climbed the hill behind their house to watch the sunset. The view was spectacular, stretching out over the valley with the mountains rising in the distance, the cattle grazing peacefully below. They sat on the grass, Delilah leaning against Nathan's chest, his arms wrapped around her. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had not come to Colorado?" Nathan asked. "Sometimes. But I cannot really imagine it anymore. This life, with you and our children, feels like the only life I was meant to have. What about you? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not offered me that job? I think about how close I came to not stopping that day by the creek. I had been on my way to see Mrs. Henderson, but I almost turned back because I had so much work to do. If I had made that choice, I never would have met you, never would have fallen in love, never would have had this family. It makes me realize how fragile happiness can be, how it sometimes depends on a single decision or a moment of chance." "Or fate," Delilah said softly. "Maybe we were meant to find each other. Maybe we were. All I know is that I am grateful every single day that I saw you struggling with those water buckets, and that I was raised by a mother who taught me to help when I see someone in need. That one act of basic kindness led to the greatest happiness of my life." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. From the house below, they could hear their children's voices, laughing about something, and the sound filled Delilah with contentment. "We have built a good life," she said. "Sometimes I think about that scared young woman living in a tent, and she feels like a different person from who I am now. But then I remember that she had the courage to come west alone, to keep trying even when everything seemed hopeless, to accept help when it was offered. She was stronger than she knew. She was. And she grew into an even stronger woman, one who could run a ranch household, raise 4 children, and still find time to bring joy to everyone around her. I am proud of you, Delilah, and proud of what we have accomplished together." As darkness fell, they made their way back down the hill hand in hand, returning to the house full of light and noise and life. Their children were gathering around the dinner table, and Delilah moved into her role as mother and organizer, making sure everyone had enough to eat and mediating the friendly arguments that always seemed to arise when the whole family was together. Nathan sat at the head of the table, surveying his family with satisfaction, catching Delilah's eye and smiling in a way that made her heart flutter even after all these years. After dinner, when the younger children had been put to bed and Daniel and William had retreated to their rooms to read, Nathan and Delilah sat on the porch swing together, rocking gently in the cool evening air. 20 years, Delilah said wonderingly. 20 years since I came to this ranch. "The best 20 years of my life," Nathan replied, kissing the top of her head. Here is to 20 more and then 20 more after that. I will take as many as we are given, Delilah said, snuggling closer to him. As long as I have you, I have everything I need. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges and joys. The children grew into adults, each making their own way in the world while remaining close to their parents and to each other. Daniel took over more and more of the ranch operations as Nathan began to slow down, proving himself a worthy successor who had learned his father's lessons well about fairness and hard work. William went to Denver for school as planned and became a teacher, eventually returning to Aspen to run the schoolhouse. Emma married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who respected her strength and independence, and they built a life on their own spread, just a few miles from the Morrison Ranch. Michael, true to form, found his calling as a mediator and eventually became involved in local politics, helping to resolve disputes and bring the community together. Nathan and Delilah became grandparents multiple times over, their house once again filled with the sounds of children when their grandchildren came to visit. They took pleasure in watching their children raise families of their own, in passing down stories and traditions, in seeing the legacy they had built together extending into a new generation. As they entered their 60s, Nathan's health began to decline. The years of hard physical labor had taken their toll, and he developed a persistent cough that worried Delilah deeply. The doctor said it was not serious, but that Nathan needed to take things easier, advice that he grudgingly accepted. He turned over the day-to-day running of the ranch to Daniel completely, though he still enjoyed walking the property and offering advice when asked. Delilah's health remained good, and she continued to manage the household with efficiency, though she too had slowed down and now relied on hired help for the heavy work. She spent her time cooking, tending her garden, sewing clothes for her grandchildren, and most importantly, caring for Nathan and enjoying every moment they had together. On a warm spring morning, 40 years after Delilah had first arrived at the ranch, Nathan woke her early and asked if she would take a walk with him. They moved more slowly now than they had in their youth, but they made their way to the hill behind the house where they had spent so many evenings watching the sunset. "I wanted to come here one more time with you," Nathan said as they sat on the grass, the morning sun warming their faces. "This has always been my favorite spot on the whole ranch." "Mine too," Delilah agreed, though his words filled her with a sense of foreboding. "Nathan, are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling like the luckiest man who ever lived," he said, taking her hand. "Delilah, I need you to know that every single day I have spent with you has been a gift. You saved me just as much as I saved you, maybe more. Before you came, I was working myself to death, lonely and purposeless, despite having everything I thought I wanted. You brought love and laughter and meaning into my life. You gave me children and grandchildren and a family that any man would be proud of. You made me happy, every single day." "You made me happy too," Delilah said, tears beginning to stream down her face because she understood what he was saying, what this moment was. "Nathan, you gave me everything. A home, a family, a purpose, a love that has sustained me through every challenge. You saw me when I was invisible and you helped me when I had nothing. I love you so much." "I love you too, Delilah Irving. Never forget that. And when I am gone, do not talk like that," she interrupted, though she knew it was futile. He had been getting weaker for weeks, and she had seen the truth even as she had tried to deny it. "When I am gone," he continued gently, "I want you to remember all the good times. Remember the laughter and the love, not the sadness of the ending. Remember building this ranch together, raising our children, watching the sunsets from this hill. And know that I will be waiting for you whenever your time comes, because I cannot imagine heaven being heaven without you in it." They sat together for a long time, holding each other, watching the morning unfold over the valley they had called home for so many years. When they finally walked back to the house, Nathan was exhausted, and Delilah helped him into bed. He slept for most of the day, and when evening came, he quietly slipped away with Delilah holding his hand, and their children gathered around the bed. The grief was immense, a wave that threatened to drown Delilah in its intensity. Nathan had been her partner for 40 years, her best friend, her great love. The ranch felt empty without him, and for weeks she struggled to find purpose in days that seemed gray and meaningless. But her children rallied around her, making sure she was never alone for too long, bringing her grandchildren to visit, gently pulling her back into the rhythms of life. Slowly, very slowly, Delilah began to heal. She would never stop missing Nathan, but she learned to carry the grief alongside the joy of her memories. She found comfort in spending time with her family, in working in her garden, in sitting on the porch of the house Nathan had built for them, and remembering all the moments they had shared there. On what would have been their 45th wedding anniversary, Delilah made the trip to the cabin where Nathan had proposed all those years ago. Daniel kept it maintained, using it sometimes for guests or hands, but he had made sure it was empty that day for his mother. She walked through the small rooms, remembering the night Nathan had brought her there and shown her what he had built for her, remembering his proposal and her joy, remembering their wedding night and so many happy times after. She sat in a chair by the fireplace and spoke to Nathan as if he were there, telling him about the grandchildren, about the ranch, about how much she missed him and how grateful she remained for the life they had lived together. And as she sat there, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a certainty that their love had been real and true and worth every moment. Delilah lived for another 10 years, remaining active and engaged with her family, treasured as the matriarch who held everyone together. She told stories to her grandchildren about the old days, about coming to Colorado and living in a tent city, about meeting their grandfather and falling in love, about building the ranch and raising a family. She wanted them to know where they came from, to understand that the security and prosperity they enjoyed had been built through hard work and determination and love. When she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73, surrounded by family, everyone who knew her agreed that she had lived a good life, a life of meaning and purpose and deep love. At her funeral, Daniel spoke about his mother's courage and kindness, about how she had come to Colorado with nothing and had helped build something lasting. He talked about the love between his parents and how it had been the foundation upon which everything else was built. They buried Delilah next to Nathan on the hill behind the house, the spot they had both loved so much, with a view stretching out over the valley and the mountains beyond. On the shared headstone was inscribed their names and dates, and below that, a simple phrase that Daniel had chosen. Together they built a home, a family, and a love that endured. The Morrison Ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's management, and eventually under his children's management after him. The house Nathan and Delilah had built remained standing for over a century, a testament to the quality of Nathan's craftsmanship and the love with which it had been constructed. The cabin where he had proposed was preserved as a family treasure, and generations of their descendants heard the story of how Nathan Irving had built a cabin for a woman living in a tent city and had stayed to make sure she smiled, and how that act of kindness had blossomed into a love story that became the foundation of their entire family. In the end, what had started with a chance encounter by a creek and an offer of help had grown into something beautiful and lasting. Two people who had been lost and lonely had found each other and had built a life together that touched everyone around them. They had faced challenges and celebrated victories, raised children and built a prosperous ranch. And through it all, they had loved each other with a devotion that never wavered. The tent city, where Delilah had once lived, was long gone, replaced by the buildings and streets of a growing town. But the legacy of what happened when a rancher saw a young woman struggling with water buckets and decided to help, when he built her a cabin to give her space and dignity, when he fell in love and she loved him back, that legacy lived on in their descendants and in the stories that were passed down through the generations. A reminder that kindness and love can transform lives and create something that endures long after the people themselves have passed into memory.